Hello and what is up YouTube? My name is G3Iron and welcome to today's discussion where we will be chatting about the buff radar. We have done a couple of these discussions in the past where we've talked about a nerf radar, making suggestions about what grinding gear games might be looking at to nerf in the past, but today we're going to be focused on what it is that GGG might be looking to buff during the upcoming 3.13 patch cycle. If you are new to the channel, you can of course like, subscribe, and ding the bell to be notified about future video discussions just like this one. And if at any point in time throughout the discussion you would like to jump around, we've got timestamps placed for your convenience down below in the video description, along with some helpful links to our Twitch channel, to Patreon, as well as to the wiki pages for a couple of the different discussion points that we're going to be focusing on today. Without any further ado, let's jump into some suggestions for what GGG might buff in the upcoming 3.13 cycle. As you can see above my slightly balding forehead, there is another gorgeous picture of a gorgeous person, Chris Wilson, looking down on all of the different things that we're going to be making suggestions to become buffed and blessed in the 3.13 cycle. Today we're going to be making 3 suggestions for ascendancies to get buffed. We're going to make 3 possible suggestions for item base types to be buffed, and we're going to give 3 possible keystones that might be buffed and maybe should be buffed in the 3.13 patch cycle. Of course, all of this is just my raving geriatric lunatic opinions, so if you've got suggestions or feedback, you should probably make those in the comments down below. None of this is inside information. None of this is anything based on any kind of posts, comments, or insider information about what's going on at GGG. This is purely speculation and for discussion purposes only. First up on the buff radar is the Raider Ascendancy. Come on now, Raider has been a joke for leagues upon leagues. In fact, do you want to hear a funny joke? What's a really, really good ascendancy in Path of Exile? Raider! Alright, okay, jokes aside for just a moment. The Raider as a class actually has some pretty cool stuff, and I mean no offense to anybody out there if Raider is your favorite ascendancy, but it is themed around phasing, frenzy charges, and onslaught. All of those things individually are very, very cool, but when you combine them together into an ascendancy, well, it makes it so that way it feels really bad because each and every one of those things can be achieved through other means that don't sacrifice using an ascendancy. If you like frenzy charges, if you like facing, and if you like onslaught, you can get the basic version of all of those through lots of different mechanics available to you in Path of Exile without costing you the massive amounts of power that you could get through another ascendancy. Raider also is an attack-based ascendancy, and that makes it very specific and narrow, where essentially a whole bunch of different potential builds simply will avoid Raider because it's got buffs for attacks, which eliminate any sort of contention for builds that might want to use spells instead. So the proposed buffs that I've got for Raider are the following. Change all attack speed and attack damage lines in the Raider Ascendancy to read attack and cast speed, and instead of attack damage, just make it generic damage. This will make the Raider much more appealing for any build that's looking for damage and attack and cast speed. It's not limited to an attack-based approach. Charge generation is not a problem for the Raider Ascendancy. It's the king of frenzy charges, so let's make it really impactful to have frenzy charges and to feel the impact and the weight of those frenzy charges. So rather than having frenzy charge duration buffs on the Raider Ascendancy, my proposal would be that frenzy charge duration would be replaced by frenzy charge effect and buffing that effect by 25%. Now, some of you are already saying, oh, but Iron, that's going to be way too strong. Well, let's give it a shot and see what it does, right? Let's shake up the meta a little bit. None of this is a mechanical intensive change. These are mostly numerical changes to the Raider Ascendancy, and so you could always go in on the next patch cycle and change it back out if it turns out that 100% of the league or something is all playing Raiders. Next up on the buff Raider is the Ascendancy, the Inquisitor for Templars. Right now, the Inquisitor is themed mostly around consecrated ground, elemental resistances, or rather negating or ignoring them, and critical strikes. That's pretty cool, and it's relatively build defining in some sense, but it suffers from the Ranger problem. If you've played any kind of pen and paper RPG, it might be known as the human problem, where essentially the Inquisitor does a lot of things well, but it doesn't really do anything to inspire you into a specific play style. If you want to be a jack of all trades, okay, that's cool. If you want some generic buffs, okay, that's cool. But if you really want to hone in and focus your build and min-max your build, then the Inquisitor may or may not be a great option for you. So the proposed change that we've got today is to really focus in the Inquisitor and to make it the king of something. In this particular case, to make it the king of consecrated ground. Now, we've already been pushed a little bit this direction with the most recent updates for Inquisitor, and we want to continue to lean into that with these proposed changes today. What I've come up with and suggested today is to grant a chance to deal double damage while you are on consecrated ground. Now, that might sound like a lot, but when you consider the amount of different mechanics that are available inside Path of Exile right now, minion-based builds have got access to dealing double damage. Just getting Awakened Spell Echo support is a chance for the last repeat of your spell to deal double damage. And then, of course, there's other forms of dealing double damage or of double dipping your damage in some circumstances, whether that's through elemental damage or through physical damage and triggering impales. By allowing you to have a chance to deal double damage while you're on consecrated ground, we are really focusing and narrowing in for the Inquisitor a massive amount of power that is based around a particular style of play, which is having that consecrated ground around you. If you've got consecrated ground, you're essentially going to be a ridiculously powerful character. And of course, with some of the other buffs that are already available to Inquisitor, the effects of that consecrated ground linger for 4 seconds. So even if your consecrated ground expires, you're still going to have that chance to deal double damage for 4 seconds afterwards. In addition to this potential pitch for dealing double damage, we would also want to buff Righteous Providence from a 20% increased effect of non-damaging ailments to a 50% increase of non-damaging ailments. Imagine for a moment how strong a character could be as an Inquisitor that is standing on top of potentially consecrated ground and has got a 50% increased effect of their shock ailment, for instance. That is a powerful character. That's a fun character to dive into. Ranger and Human Syndrome, be gone. Let's make this a fun, targeted, narrowly focused ascendancy that gives you a tangible amount of raw power you can feel as a player. The third ascendancy that we're going to suggest some changes to is, of course, the Elementalist. Now, the Elementalist is in a really awkward spot. It's both simultaneously the best at some things and also the worst at others. It's themed around golems and heralds and conditional elemental effects. On the one hand, it's the best for golems. If you want to play a golemancer, Elementalist is the way to go. And if you've traded or interacted at all with anybody who's actually playing as an Elementalist over the last couple of leagues, chances are when they come to your hideout or when you go to theirs, there's a whole bunch of golems floating around. Or I guess if they're stone golems, they're rolling around. But anyway, there's a whole bunch of golems everywhere. You might think I'm crazy to bring golems up in this discussion, but golemancers, for the purposes of the Ascendancy, are incredibly powerful primarily because of 4 Ascendancy points, right? It's 2 major notables that you go out of your way to get, and then the rest of your Ascendancy is almost meaningless. On the other hand, if you're not playing a Golemancer, if you're going for those conditionally powerful elemental effects, then like for 4 or 5 seconds, you're really doing what you want to do with the build, and then for another 4 to 5 to maybe even 10 seconds, you're not doing what you want to do with the build. Conditional power in Path of Exile most of the time feels really, really bad, and most players try, if they've got conditional power available to them, to mitigate or to minimize the amount of conditional timing that they've got where their power is limited or restricted. The Elementalist Ascendancy doesn't really allow you to do that. You're simply stuck bouncing between, hey, I've got something I want versus something I don't. Hey, I've got something that I want for map clear. Hey, I've got something that I wanted for bossing and now my map clear stinks. Or now I'm fighting a boss and my bossing stinks. Conditional stuff in POE is truly problematic. It really is. So, our proposed change for the Elementalist is as follows. Add a new node which grants higher max elemental resistances per herald you have active. This essentially allows you to play a tank style of herald carry that would allow you to push your elemental resistances higher, which is something that is very, very rare and is not necessarily available on a lot of Ascendancies or even on a lot of gear. This would make for a defensive side of the Elementalist, which is otherwise relatively unheard of. It's okay to have defensive-oriented Ascendancies, and I think this would be one area where the Elementalist could offer an option that's not necessarily available with either the Necromancer or the Occultist. Think of it sort of like putting the Elementalist in a space to where the Juggernaut is at in comparison with the Chieftain and the Berserker. You've got your clear zoom build, the Berserker. You've got your clear damage of a specific type with the Chieftain. And then you've got your really, really tanky Beefcake guy, which is the Juggernaut. In this regard, this would be the Elementalist being the tanky elemental type of Beefcake character off of the Witch. In addition to this new node, we would also offer a change for Shaper of Desolation to give conflux for the element based on the highest uncapped resistance on your character. So you, instead of having conditional conflux for different elemental effects over the course of different timings and different rotations, now you can guarantee the sort of elemental conflux that you want on your particular character. If you want to have lightning conflux and have shocking all the time, then great. Just make sure that lightning is your highest uncapped resistance. If you'd rather have freeze and chill effects, great, make sure cold is. If you'd rather have ignite, then great, make sure fire is. This gives you more player agency to actually determine what sort of elemental effects and damaging ailments or non-damaging ailments you want to apply based off of your choices as a player rather than based off of a timer every couple of seconds. Lastly, for the Elementalist, we would want to propose a change to Pendulum of Destruction to give +1 to all elemental skill gems. This would read in a similar fashion to Necromancer, where Necromancer gets +2 to minion skill gems. We would want this to be +1 to all elemental gems. The reason why we would want to keep this relatively lower than the minion buff instead of getting 2 versus 1, yes, sure, some of you are going to accuse me that I simply love minions more than anything else, but the reason why numerically for game balance purposes are simply because there's a whole bigger variety, a much wider variety of elemental skill gems that are skills that would apply to this. This could potentially apply to auras and to heralds as well as to actives, and so rather than making it a +2, we'll make it a +1, but still make it a very, very strong candidate for a whole variety of builds. Next up on the buff radar is item base types. We've got 3 different suggestions here for a couple of different base types that are simply falling behind the wayside. And as we know, at Grinding Gear Games, they love to change up the meta, shift things around, keep things fresh for players. And so we've got some suggestions to do this with the types of items that are available to us and the power level that is attached to them. First off, for Staves. Staves are pretty much always outclassed by alternatives for both offensive and defensive purposes. There's no reason if you're going all out defense that you wouldn't use a shield plus any other one-handed setup. And if you're going for offensive purposes, then oftentimes a wand plus a shield is the optimal way to go, because oftentimes you don't need a second 6-link. You can get your 6-link fit into your chest piece or even a pseudo 6-link into your helm if needs be. And so the staves are oftentimes outclassed both offensively and defensively by a whole slew of options. So it's a pretty simple and straightforward change that we would offer for Staves to make them competitive and to make them viable and to make them attractive for players to choose in a whole variety of builds. The proposed change is simply this. Provide a second implicit, so this wouldn't take away from the defensive implicit or the inherent implicit that is already available for a wide variety of staves. So increase the amount of implicits on every staff by adding a simple additional implicit slot that provides +X to the number of socketed gems. This could be +1, +2, or even at an incredibly high level, +3. This instantly makes staves more attractive and more powerful for casters across the board. Even for some attack-based builds that are looking to scale up gem level as much as they can, this might actually be attractive as well. Now, instead of running around Ray class using bows, because we all know that bows are traditional caster weapons, right? Casters like wizards, famous wizards, Dumbledore and Gandalf and all kind, Merlin, they all run around using bows, right? No, they use magical staves. And of course, those staves in and of themselves need to be much more attractive in terms of Path of Exile's theming for them to actually take over in player power that's available over on top of bows, which are, at the moment, simply better than staves. We know the technology is already built in from a technological standpoint and from a mechanical standpoint where items can have multiple different implicits, and so I don't feel like this is asking too much. Maybe it might be too much to say +X and to go all the way up to +3, but the point being we can add gem levels onto staves, and that would make them very competitive and very attractive, even if it's simply an early to mid-game to mapping version of a weapon, and then maybe you still transition to your late game GG mirror tier wand plus shield combo. Now, either way, it would still make staves more attractive than what they are today. Next up is Daggers. Daggers right now have the theme of increasing your critical strike chance, but they are oftentimes outclassed. You can get critical strike chance from Ascendancy, from passive nodes, from cluster jewels, from base jewels, from simply regular gear in addition to your dagger. You can simply have a well-rolled weapon that's not a dagger that has a higher base critical strike chance, so you really don't care about the critical strike chance implicit on the dagger. Daggers themselves are really, really cool conceptually to be themed around crit, but since they're so often outclassed in the critical strike chance, right now there's kind of an opportunity for them to be improved in this way. So our proposed change would be to change the implicit from critical strike chance on daggers to now have critical strike multiplier on daggers. So essentially make it so that way players, when they're choosing to use a dagger, can go, hey, by using a dagger, I've got a lot higher end, top end damage that I can potentially hit if I'm using a dagger as opposed to something else. Make that dagger incredibly attractive for players that want to have big crits. Essentially making daggers the big crit weapon rather than simply making them a nice additional chance to crit weapon. If you want to make daggers great again, make it so that way they do damage that is comparable to somebody else simply saying, look, I don't even care about global crit strike multi, and I'll just go elemental overload and I'll do more damage that way. Make critical strike multiplier on daggers big enough so that way they're attractive versus spending a couple of passive points and just negating crit strike multi altogether. The final base type that we're going to take a look at as a proposed buff for the 3.13 cycle is base jewels. Just basic jewels. Even when I say that, right, it's tough to say, well, which kind of jewels do you mean, Iron? Like, are you talking about Abyss jewels? Are you talking about Legion Timeless jewels? Are you talking about cluster jewels? What sort of jewels are you talking about? No, I'm just talking about regular old jewels. Like, they've got no name next to them. They're as bald as my forehead. There's nothing special about them, and that's supposed to be what's special about them, is that there's nothing else that's special about them. These base jewels have been outclassed by constant increased features that have been added into Path of Exile through a whole host of different leagues. Base jewels don't have to be, well, simply vol fodder to hopefully get a corrupted implicit on. Base jewels in and of themselves could be made much, much better. They're never going to take over from cluster jewels doing what they do best. They're never going to take over from abyss jewels being flat stacking and doing what they do best. And they're never going to take over for Legion Timeless jewels for essentially altering your passive tree. They weren't designed that way, and these other jewels do their job just fine. But let's make base jewels be good at what they are good at, providing a solid base and rounding out a build in all sorts of different stats that could be available for that build. So our proposed change to make base jewels great again is to simply say allowing base jewels to be crafted on at your crafting station in your hideout. Allow them to be master crafted. Allow a base jewel, if you've got, let's say, an energy shield base build and you roll top tier ES on it, maybe allow it so that way that's all you keep on there, and then you master craft and have 2 or 3 other crafted available slots that you can choose what you want on those jewels. This would allow for a whole new purpose of crafting. It would allow for a whole bunch more crafting to be specifically spent towards jewels and to really target and bring up the power level of base jewels and make them much more viable for a whole slew of different builds. They're the foundation, they're the base, they can add to a whole bunch of different stats that you already want on your build, but let's make it now so that way you can emphasize that particular jewel even further and make it more specialized for your particular build by allowing you to craft on it and determine what you'd like the stats to be on your jewels that you're using for your build. Also, as a slight side note, it would also potentially provide a sink for Exalted Orbs, which might fix some of the economy right now. But anyway, that's a whole other discussion. We're not going to have that today. Just make base jewels great again. Let them be crafted on. The third thing on the radar today is keystones, and the first keystone that comes to mind is Supreme Ego. Supreme Ego is designed with a ton of downsides, and almost all the buffs of what normally you would have from having auras are pretty much lost. This is what Supreme Ego reads right now. You can only have one permanent aura from your skills. Auras from your skills do not affect allies. Auras from your skills have 50% more effect on you and 50% more mana reserved. So on the one hand, you give up all of the normal stuff that you pretty much would think you would be getting with auras, and you have this increased massive amount of mana reservation, which essentially means that you don't necessarily want to go MOM or do anything else with your mana. And then on the other hand, you get this massive buff to that one permanent aura that you're going to use. Okay, that's pretty interesting. That's pretty cool, potentially. But there's so many downsides that this particular keystone suffers from. Maybe we can make it more attractive by providing the following buff. Our proposed change is to remove the "you can only have one permanent aura" line and change the 50% more effect to 25% more effect. So bring down the top end of how much aura effectiveness you're getting from this couple of auras, because now instead of being limited to a single aura, now you can use a whole bunch of auras if you can fit them into your mana, because you still have that 50% more mana reserve. Now you can, of course, dump all of your mana into your auras if you want, and they're all going to be better for you. They're not going to be better for your minions. They're not going to be better for other allies, other party members, but they're going to be better for you, but they're going to come at a much, much steeper cost in terms of your mana reservation. The second proposed change and buff that we've got on the radar for keystones is the Point Blank keystone. Point Blank is designed with attack projectiles in mind and reads the following. Projectile attacks hits deal up to 30% more damage to targets at the start of their movement, dealing less damage to targets as the projectile travels further. Recently in Path of Exile development, there have been more and more skills that are granting players zones of control, or having essentially zone styles of fights. We can see this with things like Sigil of Power in the most recent 3.12 update. Laying down skills that give you effectively a zone that you want to be in, or a zone that you want your enemies to be in, let's say with Frost Shield, is very, very cool conceptually and rewards players for actually thinking and positioning themselves in relationship to their enemies during combat. In my opinion, Point Blank should be the archetypal keystone for that situationally aware, positionally aware style of gameplay for projectile-based characters. Notice I said projectile-based characters and not just projectile attack-based characters. That's because our proposed change is the following. Remove the attack hits to simply say a generic more multiplier across the board for anything that hits. So projectiles hit. That's the proposed change, rather than projectile attacks. This would allow for Point Blank to actually become an attractive keystone for spell-based builds, which typically don't come down towards the bottom right side of the tree. It might make it so that way there's some more diversity and some more opportunity for players who are already down on the bottom right-hand side of the tree. And for players who aren't on the bottom right-hand side of the tree, it might provide some motivation to go down there and get Point Blank. I would also propose buffing the numerical value on Point Blank up from 30% to 40% more damage, because right now you've got Pain Attunement that gives you 30% more spell damage up already available in the tree at the price of going low life. Point Blank puts you in a danger zone by putting you much closer towards the enemy that might potentially shotgun you or deal damage to you, or potentially puts you in melee range for a whole lot of monsters that otherwise wouldn't even have the chance to hit you. So Point Blank in and of itself offers a number of downsides by simply having you play as a situationally and positionally aware player. Because of that, you should be rewarded more than Pain Attunement. At least that's my crazy geriatric opinion. Our final keystone that we'll look today, and our final suggestion for the 3.13 upcoming buff cycle, is the Resolute Technique keystone. Resolute Technique was originally designed with the downside of essentially giving up all of your bonuses of Critical Strike Chance and Critical Strike Multi in exchange for getting consistency with accuracy. Essentially saying, hey, you don't have to scale up your accuracy, but you also won't get the benefit of scaling up your Critical Strike Chance or your Critical Strike Multiplier. Back in the day for designing Path of Exile, this was a really, really cool and interesting keystone, but it needs to be brought into the year 2020. So the proposed change that we've got for Resolute Technique to still have a drawback, but still also offer a potential option that makes it attractive for players is this. Change the phrase "never deal critical strikes" to simply read minus 25% to critical strike chance and minus 50% to critical strike multiplier. This means you can essentially take Resolute Technique. You're going to have the buff and the effect of having enemies never evade your attacks, but you don't have to give up entirely your critical strike chance and entirely your global critical strike multiplier. Instead, there's an opportunity cost here for you. It is a cost rather than a complete negation and deletion of specific game mechanics that could otherwise benefit you. After all, if you're never missing something, there should be some sort of penalty for that. But I think that the penalty right now is simply too steep, and therefore a lot of players will avoid it if possible. Before you go today, I'd like to make a friendly recommendation of a good friend of ours here at Good Guy Gaming, Kaytrim. He's live over on Twitch, and he also posts videos over on YouTube. He is a fantastically helpful player who loves to play a wide variety of different builds. He always likes to play melee builds, which he and I always butt heads about, but whenever I've got questions about about Melee and I want to see what a Melee build looks like, I go and I chat it up with Kaytrim. If you can remember the bygone days where Pac-Man and Galaga were actually a thing, then you probably can strike up a conversation with Kaytrim because he remembers those times as well. If you're looking for other chill gamers who are willing to kick it back, have a great conversation with you, and are consistent with their channel programming, then I highly recommend Kaytrim. He streams every single week, these are US-based times, on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, pretty much from 11 until 2 p.m. Well, thanks so much for joining us for today's discussion. I've got a couple of questions for you to answer down below in the comments. First off, what do you think should be buffed for the 3.13 patch cycle? That is a question where I want to know your opinions. I've given you a whole bunch of my opinions about ascendancies, about item base types, and about keystones, but I'd love to know your thoughts down below. They don't have to be restricted to ascendancies, base types, or keystones. Just let me know what you think should be buffed in the upcoming 3.13 patch cycle. Also, what are you hoping is buffed? Not just what you think should be buffed, but what are you hoping? Maybe it's a particular build, maybe it's a particular unique that you'd like to build around, maybe it's a particular skill gem. What are you hoping to be buffed in the 3.13 patch cycle? Thanks once again for joining us. Big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters, and I hope today is the day that a Mirror of Calandra drops for you.
Thanks for watching that video. If you'd like more information on any of our discussion points today, you can see them down below in the video description. If you'd also like to join our Discord or support our Patreon, you can do so with the links down below. Thanks again, and big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters.